mystery of Pompeii's lost secrets. What you are about to hear is not a legend. It begins not with thunder, but with silence. Ash fell like snow, soft and steady. Beneath it, time paused. An entire city, vibrant and flawed, vanished beneath a sky that rained fire. But it wasn't the eruption that made Pompeii eternal. It was the lives caught mid-sentence, the whispers carved into stone, the footsteps that stopped just before the door. And tonight, we follow them. So before we begin, pause, let go, drift. And when the fire burns low and your eyes grow heavy, know this: what waits in the silence below is real. When you wake, the sources of the story will be waiting in the description. Chapter 1. The Room That Time Forgot. In the year 2020, within the ruins of Region 5 in Pompeii, archaeologists opened a doorway that had been sealed for nearly 2,000 years. Behind the hardened wall of pumice and debris, they expected to find storage or nothing at all. What they found was a room no one had touched since the sky turned black and the air turned to poison. There was no bed, no window, just a low ceiling, the remains of peeling frescoes on crumbling plaster, and the contorted bones of 3 human figures. They had not died peacefully. One skeleton, smaller than the others, perhaps a child, lay close to an adult figure curled inward, shielding, protecting, bracing. Their final gesture frozen in time. They called it a servant's room. But the story the room whispered suggested otherwise. She was named Aelia. Not noble, not known. Her name survives only in a faint inscription scratched into the wall above a broken shard of pottery. Aelia custodit. Aelia watches. They said it was a joke, that she guarded tools. But Aelia had been watching something more. She worked as a weaver in the villa. Her days were long, her laughter rare. Before dawn, when the streets were still and the dust had not yet risen, she dyed linens and spun wool with stained fingers. Madder for red, indigo for blue, fermented urine for yellow. She belonged to others, and yet her mind was her own. When the house slept, she would light her small oil lamp and draw charcoal scratches on the plaster walls. Faces, birds, stars. She was not allowed to leave marks. Slaves were not permitted to keep memory. But she had no parchment, no ink, and her thoughts needed somewhere to live. She listened through walls, not out of curiosity, but because sound was the only companion. Footsteps in the atrium, rats behind the grain jar, the soldiers' march in the distant forum. Some nights, she imagined walking freely past the city gates, down toward the sea. She had never seen it, but once, a vendor held a shell to her ear and said, "There, girl, that's what freedom sounds like." She had smiled, but said nothing. On the morning of August 24th, a tremor rattled the walls. Fine dust floated from the ceiling. One amphora tipped, the air pressed down like wet cloth. Outside, birds flew low, dogs whined and would not eat. Somewhere near the bathhouse, a child began to cry. No one fled. Pompeii had shaken before. The gods were restless, but always calmed. Aelia fetched water that morning. Mount Vesuvius loomed cloudless, save for a single strange plume of smoke, thin and pale, twisting upward from the summit like a thread spun too tight. She watched it for a long time, then turned away. She had work to do. But something lingered, a silence behind the eyes. Sunlight slanted into the atrium and caught the dust midair like silver threads caught in a loom. Aelia touched the stone beneath her feet and whispered a word she hadn't spoken in years. Domus. Home. Not this place. but a memory of one, before her hands had learned the burn of wool and ash. That night she moved slower than usual. She lit the oil lamp, picked up her charcoal, and on the last bare space of plaster, she drew something new. Not a face, not a star, a wave, high, curling forward, not of water, but of ash. She didn't know why. Her hand moved before thought. The lamp flickered, and then the earth began to groan. Chapter 2. When the mountain spoke. The first sound was not a scream, it was a sigh, a long, low breath from the mountain, ancient and buried deep. Horses panicked in their stalls, birds scattered inland, and the dogs vanished. Aelia had just begun to drift into sleep when the tremor hit. The lamp fell and rolled against the wall, casting one final flicker before the dark swallowed it. The floor pulsed beneath her like a giant heartbeat. She clutched the doorframe, held her breath, waited for silence. But silence did not come. The air outside had changed. It smelled of sulfur and iron, hot coins pressed to the tongue. Pumice began to fall, a drizzle of stone that danced off rooftops and burned the skin. She stepped into the corridor, heart hammering. Voices echoed in panic, some calling to the gods, others calling for mothers. Confusion, chaos. From the courtyard, she looked toward Vesuvius. The peak was gone. In its place, a towering column of fire and ash, dark at its roots, blood red at its tip. It churned, alive. Thunder cracked from within, but no rain came. Only ash, only stone, and the knowledge that the world had changed. She ran, not to flee, but to retrieve something. The wave, the drawing, a warning she didn't understand. She tore linen from her bedding, pressed it against the charcoal, rubbed until the lines transferred in blurred gray. She tied it around her waist and turned to leave, but the smoke had already reached the hallway. In the marketplace, silence had fallen. The forum, once filled with merchants and children, stood buried to the knees in ash. Statues stared through a veil of dust. Fires in the bakeries had long gone out. Some people stayed, believing the worst had passed. They prayed in wine cellars, scratched messages onto walls. Forgive me. Find my brother. We are here. Aelia did not pray. She ran. She knew the roads, the turns. She headed for the vineyards near the Garden of the Fugitives, not yet known by that name. Then it was only the edge of the city, a wild place, a way out, but the ash was faster. By midday the streets were gray, each breath a knife, each step a struggle. She passed faces frozen in terror, children coughing, old men sitting down for the last time. Still, she moved forward. Near the amphitheater, a beam blocked her path. She dropped to her knees, crawling. The linen slipped from her waist. She didn't see it vanish beneath the ash. When she emerged, Pompeii was already gone, not shattered, buried. Columns stood like bones. The sky glowed red behind walls of smoke. There were no voices, no birds. And then the surge came. It moved faster than thought, hotter than fire. She turned just once and looked back toward the city. The home that held her, the prison that named her, the place where she once dreamed of the sea. And then it was dark. Chapter 3. Ashes that remember. The first surge did not burn. It erased. Hotter than molten lead, the pyroclastic flow surged down Vesuvius's slopes at a speed no one could outrun. It was not fire. It was gas and ash and death. Nearly 500 degrees Celsius, so sudden, so violent it boiled the blood in seconds. Aelia never screamed. There was no time. Her lungs collapsed before sound could form. Skin blistered. muscles stiffened, and in an instant she was still, but her shadow remained. 2,000 years later, archaeologists found her, not her voice, not her name, but the space her body had left behind. In the hardened ash, they poured liquid plaster into the hollow. When it set and was lifted, she emerged, curled on her side, arms drawn close, face turned away. Some said she was hiding, others believed she was shielding something, or someone. But there was no child, no lover, no artifact of value, only her. And near her chest, a bundle. It was linen, a pouch stitched by hand, fused to what was left of the rib cage. Inside they found a piece of charcoal and a folded scrap of cloth. The red dye had long since faded, but the wave remained. Some dismissed it as coincidence, a pattern, a stain. Others disagreed, because nearby, beneath centuries of soot etched into stone, they found something else. A line of ancient graffiti, scratched in haste, barely visible now even under a microscope. When the mountain breathes, run to the edge. Watch the sea rise in the sky. No name, no date, just a warning or a memory. They still called the space a slave's quarters, but it was more than a room. It was a life. There were no riches, no gold, no heirlooms, but there were tools, dyes, brushes, jars of pigment, and on a single shelf, blackened but intact, a wooden stylus. Experts say she was a fabric worker, a servant trained in stitch and hew, but carved into the underside of the stylus was something else. A wave, and above it, shaky, deliberate lines forming an eye. Alia's story should have ended in silence, but Ash remembers. It clings to what the world forgets, moments no one else saw, breaths no one else heard. Perhaps she wasn't a prophet. Perhaps she wasn't trying to save anyone. Perhaps she was simply afraid and left behind the only thing she could. A mark, a whisper, a final breath. And tonight, it reaches us. As the fire crackles, as the shadows flicker, imagine her not as a ghost, not as a statue, but as a girl sitting in the dark, drawing with charcoal and dreaming of the sea. Chapter 4, The Lost Corridor. Long after the ash had settled, long after empires rose and fell, Pompeii slept beneath the dust. For centuries, it was a vineyard above a grave. People walked on it, planted over it, built near it, never knowing what waited below. Then, in the 21st century, archaeologists returned to Region 5, not with shovels and picks, but with scanners, drones, and radar. They were looking for floors, walls, foundations, but they found something else. Beneath the shattered remains of a portico, sealed so tightly it took weeks to clear without damage, they uncovered a hidden corridor. No entrance, no air, just stone and pressure, locked for centuries. And behind it, a room with color. Unlike the modest servants' quarters, this chamber belonged to someone of status. The walls were painted in rich ochres and deep crimson. The frescoes, still radiant, danced with birds, vines, and half-seen creatures that peeked from behind painted columns. No bodies were found, but there were shadows. A bronze bowl near the wall, a broken mirror, a wooden comb miraculously whole, the outline of a stool, and near the center of the room, an inscription painted high above the lintel. Let beauty remain, even if we do not. It was unsigned, but on the baseboard, scratched into the plaster in smaller, more personal script, was a name. Livia. Livia, perhaps the daughter of the house, perhaps a guest. No one knows. But what made the archaeologists pause was not her name. It was what they found in the adjoining chamber. A fresco, unfinished, lines only half drawn, figures missing their faces, and in the center, clear and detailed, stood a woman, her eyes alive with light, her robe outlined in red, every curve of her cheek, every strand of hair, deliberate, but there was no signature, and no other subject. The painter had stopped mid-stroke, or been stopped. Some believed Livia had commissioned it, others wondered if she had painted it herself. Women of status were rarely artists, but this house was different. In a nearby chest they found pigments, gold leaf, brushes worn from use, and tucked near the hearth, a wax tablet. Its script matched the inscription. And the woman in the fresco, she bore a striking resemblance to Aelia. The tilt of the head, the nose, the brow. Aelia, the servant. Livia, the noble. And yet, their paths had crossed. Theories bloomed. Were they sisters, lovers, master and maid, or simply two women who saw each other clearly when no one else did? Aelia left waves. Livia left women. Both knew the world would forget their voices, so they left images instead. In the rubble beneath the unfinished wall, they found something small, splintered wood, carefully preserved, a triptych, a folding panel once used for private devotion. Its outer panels were scorched, but the inside remained. A woman stood at the edge of a shore, behind her, a mountain, and in the sky above, smoke. They dated the image to mere months before the eruption. There was no name, but in every pigment, in every stroke, one voice echoed louder than the rest. Livia. Perhaps she saw what was coming. Perhaps no one listened. But the paint remembered. And so do we. Chapter 5. The Man Who Stayed. They found him near the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, the other reaching back. His body had collapsed sideways, as if he had heard something, just before the fire came. His legs were bent, his face turned toward the courtyard. He was older than most of those found near the city gates, broad-shouldered, thick-boned, a man who had once been strong. Near his feet lay a bronze ring. It had slipped from his fingers, or perhaps he had been holding it out to someone. The house where they found him was modest, 2 rooms, a garden, a small fountain clogged with centuries of ash, but its walls told a louder story. Painted across the central room was a scene from the Odyssey, Odysseus bound to the mast, resisting the siren's song. The colors had faded, but the agony in the eyes was still there. Beneath the fresco, carved into the plaster in small, careful letters, was a single Latin word: expecto. I wait. They never learned his name, but among the excavation teams they began to call him Marcus. He was likely a tradesman, a metal worker perhaps, or a merchant. His home was filled with tools, weights, scraps of pigment. In the back room they found a chest of scrolls, charred and fragile. One of them, barely legible, was a copy of the Aeneid. That alone marked him as someone educated. And near the scrolls, a pair of children's sandals. There were no other bodies in the house, no woman, no child, only him, and the empty sandals. Some believed he had sent his family away, toward the harbor, before the sky turned. Others said he had stayed behind to guard the house, or because, like many, he thought the danger would pass. But the evidence suggested something else. The door had been barred from the inside, not to keep others out, but to keep something in don't. Outside, the street was chaos. Ceramic and glass shattered from the tremors. Statues toppled from their plinths. The sky darkened as the ash thickened. Marcus must have heard it. Stone collapsing, people screaming, the rush of air carrying death with it. He reached for the door, but he didn't run. Near his hand, embedded in the wood, was a nail, part of the doorframe. Nearby, hidden beneath layers of ash, they found cloth, coarse wool, stained red, a child's tunic, folded neatly, pressed flat, not dropped, placed. It told them everything. He hadn't been escaping. He had turned back to say goodbye, or to wait for a voice, a shadow, a promise that the ones he sent away might come home again. Today, the plaster cast of Marcus rests in a museum, still reaching, still waiting. But the house where he died still stands, roofless, quiet. The fresco of Odysseus watches from the wall. The sirens still sing, and in the silence between their notes, you can almost hear the last whisper of a man who chose not to run. Chapter 6, the final act. At the edge of the city, carved into the slope of a hill, stood the large theater of Pompeii. It had once echoed with voices, music, applause, the rise and fall of tragedy and farce. Tiered stone seats circled a wide stage. There were no curtains, no artificial lights, only the sky and the story. But in the final hours, the stage went silent, and some never left. Archaeologists found them in the back rows, hunched forward, heads in hands. At first, it was assumed they had come seeking shelter, believing thick walls and marble steps would shield them from what fell. But their positions told another story. Some were seated, upright like watchers. Others curled behind the stage. A few clung to one another. One woman held a woven basket, crushed beneath her weight. Inside it, a loaf of bread, still intact, preserved by fire. Bread in a theater, on the day the sky fell. It puzzled the researchers until they studied the layers of ash. These victims weren't caught in the second surge. They had been there from the beginning, which meant only one thing. They had come to see a play. August 24th, 79 A.D. A Roman comedy had been scheduled, a satire mocking gods and fools. A temporary stage was built. Banners fluttered in the summer breeze. Trumpets likely rang through the forum. The city had gathered. Vendors sold spiced wine and honeyed dates. Children darted between the marble columns. The holiday air was light, expectant. And in the theater, they waited. They never heard the mountain's first breath. Backstage, actors prepared. The crowd murmured. The painted curtain began to rise. And then the light changed. The sky dimmed. The breeze stilled. A soft rain of pumice began to fall. Some laughed. Pompeii was used to tremors. The mountain often rumbled. But then came the quake, and the sky turned black. Panic surged. The exits were narrow. The steps were steep. People stumbled. Some turned back. Others didn't. Some hid beneath the stage. Others behind masks, hoping the gods might spare the artists. They weren't. Behind the backdrop, one body was found in costume. Her robe singed, golden trim melted along the sleeves. In her hand was a small bronze figurine of Apollo, the god of music, of prophecy, of truth, melted to her fingers. The plaster casts from the theater are among the most haunting. They do not scream. They do not run. They wait. Some with bowed heads, others still facing the stage, like watchers unwilling to leave before the final act. And maybe that's what Pompeii was in the end. A performance interrupted, a story halted mid-line, and we, the living, are now its audience. Chapter 7, beneath the marble and steam. The Stabian baths were the oldest in Pompeii. Long before the empire rose, they had already been carved and shaped, polished stone by polished stone, into a sanctuary of water and light. The walls danced with painted dolphins, ceilings curved like seashells, pools glowed under flickering lamps. It was a place of luxury, of ritual, but also of habit. People came not only to cleanse, but to escape. When the eruption began, the bathhouse was full. It was early afternoon. Some had just finished soaking. Others still sat in the tepidarium, the warm room where steam curled lazily in the air and voices echoed like whispers in a dream. No one saw the ash cloud at first, but they felt it. The walls trembled. The ceiling gave a long, low groan. Far off, screams rose and then disappeared, smothered by the thick marble, muted like sound underwater. Then, the air shifted, heavier, tighter. The warmth turned suffocating, and the light began to fade. Many ran, barefoot, robes half-tied, hair still wet. But not all. In the caldarium, the hot room, some lingered. The stone walls had protected them before, through earthquakes, through storms. Why would this time be different? A few waited too long. They were found pressed to the marble, backs against the walls, hands clutched around benches. One had tied cloth over his mouth. Another lay beside an overturned amphora of water, its contents long since vaporized. And near the furnace, they found him, crouched beside the braziers, clutching something. At first, they thought he was a stoker, one of the slaves who kept the waters warm. But the bundle in his arms wasn't tools, wasn't fuel. It was a child, a small boy, maybe 4 years old. His arms wrapped tight around the man's neck, their bodies fused together. A single cast, a single story. No names were left behind, no records, no inscriptions. But the archaeologists gave him one anyway, the keeper. He had not been found near an exit. He had not run. He had stayed in the hottest part of the building, where even on ordinary days, the heat could blister skin. Perhaps he thought the ash wouldn't reach them there. Perhaps he had nowhere else to go. Some believe the boy was his son. Others think he was a bather's child, left behind in panic. But the truth is in the posture. He didn't drop the bundle. He didn't shield himself. He held the boy tight, as if warmth could protect them both, as if the fire that once gave comfort might still save them. It didn't. But the bathhouse remembered. The walls still stand. The dolphins still swim. The drains still slope gently toward the sea. And in a quiet chamber, unmarked and still, their cast remains, man and child, frozen in a final embrace. Not running, not hiding, just holding on. Chapter 8. The Last Prayer. At the heart of Pompeii stood a temple dedicated to Venus, the city's protector, goddess of love, fate, and birth. Her marble columns caught the rising sun. Her altar looked toward the sea. Worshippers brought offerings, flowers, oils, coins, prayers whispered between incense and stone. But when Vesuvius woke, even the gods fell silent. The temple collapsed in the eruption, its columns shattered, its rooftop buried. But not everything inside was destroyed. In 2018, a modern survey team uncovered a hidden sanctum beneath the ruins. They expected debris, scattered pottery, maybe a broken altar. They did not expect her. She was alone, kneeling before the altar, arms raised, head bowed. Her robes were still arranged, white linen, stained with time and ash. A bronze bracelet circled her wrist. Etched on it, S.P. No one knows what the letters meant. Next to her lay a small oil lamp carved with the image of Fortuna, the goddess of chance. Was she a priestess, an acolyte, or a sacrifice? Her hands were not clenched, not defensive. They were open, palms up as if offering something or pleading. Beside her were 3 items: a bowl of dried figs, a clay figurine of Venus, and a single iron key. This was no accident, no desperate shelter. It was ritual. Perhaps she believed the goddess would answer, that the sanctum would hold, that if she gave enough, all might be spared. Or perhaps she was chosen. In ancient times, disaster was blamed on broken oaths, on angered gods, on forgotten rites, and in moments of fear, people turned back to those beliefs. Some ran, some hid, some offered. Today, visitors walk among the cracked stones of the Forum, unaware of the temple's secrets beneath their feet. But in that chamber below, still quiet, they've reconstructed the moment. Not for spectacle, but for memory. A woman kneeling, her prayer unheard, her face calm, as if she believed in her final breath she had done enough. Chapter 9, The Gate That Didn't Open. At the far edge of the city stood the Nuxerian Gate, thick stone, iron reinforcements. It had once welcomed traders and travelers from the fertile lands beyond, the road to New Syria, to freedom, to safety. But on that day, in 79 AD, it became something else, a trap, a threshold never crossed. They found them just outside the gate. 13 bodies, frozen in motion, mothers, children, one man with a rope still tied around his waist, perhaps trying to lead others through the smoke. The archaeologists called them the fugitives, not because they were criminals, but because they had almost escaped. Their final poses were haunting. A child clung to his mother's back, face buried in her tunic. 2 brothers huddled near a broken cart. A pregnant woman lay curled beside a basket of almonds and dried dates. And one man had fallen just steps from the road beyond the wall, arms outstretched, reaching, as if the world beyond was still waiting. They had run from the city, perhaps after the first ashfall, perhaps as roofs began to cave and statues crumbled. The way was narrow. The sky had already turned to fire. And just as they reached the gate, the second pyroclastic surge came. It did not burn, it erased. Faster than a scream, hotter than flame. Everything went still. What struck the archaeologists wasn't just how they fell. It was what they carried. Not gold, not tools, not riches. Life. The mother had a tiny locket, inside a carved portrait, too scorched to recognize. The brothers had dice in their pockets. The man with the rope carried a wax tablet, tucked beneath his belt. On it, barely legible, Persevera. Hold on. They weren't lost. They weren't looters. They had a plan. They had hope. But death in Pompeii did not knock. It did not pause. It came in silence and struck in seconds. And the gate closed behind them. When their bodies were uncovered in the 1960s, the impressions were so precise that folds of cloth and fragments of sandals remained. Today, their casts lie together in a garden near the city wall, not scattered, not anonymous, but in a line, facing outward, as if still walking, still reaching, still trying to get home. Chapter 10, The Scribe of Via dell'Abbondanza. The Via dell'Abbondanza was the artery of Pompeii. It pulsed with life, taverns, bathhouses, painted signs for wine and bread, shops with mosaics at their thresholds. In the morning, carts rattled past. Water splashed from fountains. Children ran shouting between doorways. But at the far end of the street, behind closed shutters, a man was writing. His home was elegant, frescoes of myth, floors tiled in black and white. But it wasn't his wealth that set him apart. It was his words. Dozens of wax tablets were found inside, stacked neatly in a scorched wooden chest. Letters, inventories, fragments of philosophy. And at the very end of the stack, a final line. Fire rains from the sky. I will stay. They called him the Scribe. His name is lost, but his voice remains. From his writings, they knew he was educated. Maybe a teacher, maybe a magistrate's clerk. And then, halfway through a final tablet, something changed. The handwriting faltered. The sentences grew short, uneven. He wrote about the sounds, the walls groaning, tiles cracking, birds falling from the sky. He wrote of a sky that breathed fire, of ground that rolled like waves. He didn't beg, he didn't plead. He recorded a period. Why didn't he run? Maybe he was injured, or maybe he believed that if he wrote it all down, something might survive. That even if he was lost, the truth wouldn't be. He wanted someone to know. We were here. We saw it. We tried to understand. They found his body in the tablinum, the study. He had taken shelter near a heavy wooden table, his arms outstretched. The plaster cast shows him in motion, falling, reaching, or perhaps still writing. Beside him lay a stylus, bent, blackened, still resting on a final tablet. One word etched at its center. Silence. He could not know what would remain. Not names, not sounds, not the scent of bread or the laughter of children. But his words did. And now, when we walk the Via dell'Abbondanza, through the sunlit ruins, past broken fountains and painted walls, we walk through his thoughts. Every echo between the stones is his. Every hush in the dust is his. Because when the sky burned and Pompeii began to vanish, he wrote. Chapter 11. The ships that never left. Pompeii had a harbor once. It lay beyond the city walls, where the Sarno River flowed into the sea. Ships came from Hispania, from Gaul, from Alexandria. They brought wine, oil, glass, silk. And when danger came, they brought escape. So when the mountain roared, people ran, not to temples or homes, but to the port, because the sea had always meant safety. In 1982, near what had once been the marina walls, archaeologists discovered a passage buried under meters of ash and silt. It led to the boathouses, arched vaults used to store nets, tools, and small vessels. But inside, they found something else. Skeletons, pressed against the stone, curled in corners, clustered in the dark. There were over 300 bodies, men, women, children. Some still wore jewelry, others had tools in their hands. A few held each other. They had made it to the shore, to the edge of the world, but the sea did not save them. Just as the boats were being loaded, perhaps already casting off, the pyroclastic surge reached the coast. Hotter than fire, faster than breath, wood exploded. Sails caught flame. People dove into the water, only to find it boiling. Those who remained were not reduced to ash. They became shadows. Some held cloth to their faces. Some cradled infants. One man sat upright, arms folded, eyes turned outward, waiting. In front of him, pressed into the hardened ash, were footprints, small, bare, running toward him, unstopping, No child was found nearby, only the prince, as if someone had made it to him, or tried to. They found coins clutched in fists, gold, silver, desperation, and near the entrance to one vault, charred, warped, was a boat. Its hull cracked, its oars fused to the dock. It had never left, but someone had tried. Today, the boathouses are quiet again. The sea breeze slips through their arches. The waves lap at the stone. In the museum nearby, casts of the victims lie side by side. One display is especially quiet. A woman curled around a dog, its mouth frozen mid-snarl, her eyes closed. Perhaps she reached peace, or perhaps she simply stopped running. They had made it to the end, but there was no escape, because the sky burned, the earth swallowed, and the sea turned its back. Chapter 12. The city that speaks without sound. Pompeii is still, excavated, exposed, silent. But if you listen, not with your ears, but with something deeper, you can hear them, not as ghosts, but as people. Pompeii is not a story about ash or lava or destruction. It is a story about interruption, lives cut off mid-sentence, steps frozen before the door, bread left to rise, letters left unfinished, a child reaching for her mother, a man writing his final line, a woman whispering to gods who did not answer. And yet, they speak through the plaster, shaped from emptiness, through the paint, clinging to cracked walls, through the sandals at the threshold, the comb on the shelf, the drawing of a wave, hidden in cloth. What other city tells us so much by never saying a word? The tragedy of Pompeii is not what was lost. It's how close it feels. Their graffiti still makes us laugh. Their prayers still make us pause. Their fears of time, of silence, of death mirror our own. And that is why we return, why we scan every ruin, study every face, whisper their names even when we do not know them. Because in the quiet of Pompeii, we see ourselves, not as we wish to be, but as we truly are. So when the fire crackles low and the night grows long, when stories feel like dreams and facts feel like myths, remember this. One woman lit a lamp and drew a wave. One man picked up his stylus and wrote silence. Another turned toward the sea and didn't make it. And all of them are still here. Chapter 13. The room with no doors. There is a building in Pompeii that no one noticed for a very long time. It sits quietly, tucked between two larger homes on a forgotten street. Its outer walls unremarkable, its roof long collapsed. For decades it was believed to be a storehouse, a place for amphorae, or tools, until 2005. That's when archaeologists uncovered something strange. A room, sealed on all sides, no windows, no doors, and inside, nothing. At first glance, the chamber seemed empty, just cracked plaster, a broken bowl, fragments of blackened wood. But when the dust settled, the walls whispered. There were marks, scratches, clusters of straight lines, circular patterns traced in ash, and in one corner, beneath a patch of soot-darkened stone, a shallow pit. Too shallow for storage, too smooth to be accidental. A fire had been lit there, intentionally, again and again, for years. They called it the ritual room, not because they knew what had happened there, but because nothing made sense. No god named, no tools for worship, only the faint scent of ancient ash, and a circle burned into stone. Theories emerged like steam. A private cult, a mourning space, a place for healing or punishment. There was no seating, no comforts, only the echo of repetition. And then, a shelf, high on the wall, above the reach of a standing person. On it, fused into place by the eruption's heat, were three objects: a dried sprig of rosemary, a carved figurine with no face, and a folded scrap of papyrus, too scorched to read. Together they formed no clear story, but they were placed deliberately. Some believe it was a room for grief, a hidden sanctuary where the owner mourned alone, unseen by neighbors or gods. Others think it was something darker, a place of forced silence, of punishment, of shame. But then they found the inscription on the underside of the shelf, written in charcoal, light without end, and beside the words, an eye, watching. The fire pit held more clues, layers of ash, each one compacted, burned again and again. A pattern, a rhythm, a memory. The final layer was different. It wasn't cooled by time. It was snuffed out instantly, by ash. No hand extinguished it. No ritual ended it. The eruption had done that, all at once. Today, the room remains sealed. Only the entry has been opened. No modern visitor has stepped inside. And perhaps that's how it was meant to be, because some doors, the ones built without hinges, without handles, without names, were never meant to open again. Chapter 14. The Chains Beneath the Garden. Most visitors walk past the House of the Golden Cupids without a second glance. Its entrance is quiet. Its walls glow with soft reds and delicate scenes. Cupid chasing Psyche, Venus cradling a dove. Light pours into its garden. Fountains sing. Roses climb the columns. It looks like a house of love, of joy, of gentle myths. But beneath the garden, something waited. A chamber, hidden, sealed, and chained. 12 iron restraints lay inside. Some were bolted to the wall. Others lay coiled on the floor, shackled, rusted shut by centuries of silence. They were not ceremonial, not symbolic. They were functional. Each set was human-sized, each one locked, each one used. The floor bore scratch marks, deep, uneven, the kind made not by tools, but fingernails. The walls were stained, not with paint, but with something older. There was no drain, no bedding, no altar, just a vent, barely larger than a hand, carved near the ceiling, too high to reach, too narrow to speak through. And on one wall, etched into plaster, the words, "He received what he deserved." But who wrote it, and about whom? The chamber sat directly beneath the house's courtyard, a peaceful garden, tiled in mosaic, framed by columns, kissed by sunlight. Above, the water still flows. Below, only rust remains. No adjacent rooms indicated guards, no storage for food, no signals, nothing practical. And that was the most disturbing detail of all. Why would a house dedicated to beauty, to love, need a place like this? Some scholars believe it was connected to a private cult, one that believed in purification through suffering. Others suggest something far more intimate, a ritual, a punishment, not for slaves, but for family. Records show a teenage boy once lived in the house. His name, Lucius Calvinus. He died young, no cause listed. But near the household lararium, the shrine of family spirits, they found a wax tablet. Its script was uneven, frantic. It read, "He lied to the gods. He made us weak." Unsigned. Could the chains have been for him? Was this not a prison, but a place of correction? In some Roman households, children were not whipped. They were forgotten, sent below, alone, for hours, sometimes for days, until they repented, and sometimes they didn't return. In the plaster near one set of chains, they found something else. Not a name, not a phrase. A handprint, pressed into wet plaster, smaller than a man's, fingers stretched, palm smeared, a reach, the final one. There was no body, no bones, only the chains, the print, the silence, and above them, in the garden, the golden cupids still smile. They dance, they chase, they flutter in eternal delight, unaware or pretending to be. Because Pompeii is not just a city of ash and beauty, it is a city of contradiction, where a house of love can hide a chamber of pain, where fountains bubble above prisons, where laughter once echoed over chains. And maybe that's why the city still holds us, not because of what we know, but because of what we'll never know. Because beneath every mosaic, beneath every flower, beneath every perfect surface, there is always a room we were not meant to find. Chapter 15, the statue that shouldn't exist. In the northwestern corner of Pompeii, beyond the bakeries, beyond the brothels, there stands a house without a name. Its walls are plain, its rooms small, but in the center of the courtyard stands her, a statue, not Roman, not Greek, not part of any known pantheon or tale. She is a woman, carved in volcanic stone, black as cooled lava, veiled from head to toe. No face, no hands, no inscription. Her arms are crossed beneath the folds of her robe, and where her heart should be, there is a hollow. The house around her offers nothing unusual. Faded frescoes, a garden of fig trees, a collapsed kitchen. But she does not belong. There is no record of her, no copy, no precedent in Pompeii or anywhere in the empire. When archaeologists found her in 1994, they assumed she had been brought from afar, looted, placed like a trophy. But her base was original. The mortar matched the surrounding walls. She had stood there since the house was built, centuries before the eruption. And she held a secret. Scans revealed the statue was not solid. Inside the hollow at her chest was a clay urn, sealed with wax, unopened. They debated for months, and finally they removed it. The wax cracked. The urn was empty, except for dust, and a thin strip of lead, etched with 4 letters, D-O-M-E. No known word, no translation. They called her the Mourner. Some said she represented a cult of silence. Others, that she was not meant to be worshipped, but remembered. Remembered for what? No shrine, no altar, no offering, no name. One archaeologist, after a lifetime among temples and ruins, stood before her and whispered, "You don't belong here." And maybe that was the point. In a city of rules, gods, and patterns, she was the one thing that did not fit. And so she remains, veiled, silent, unknown, like the question in a dream you can't stop asking, even after you wake. And maybe Pompeii needed her, a watcher, a reminder that even in a city carved by gods, some things defy explanation. Some things are meant to remain a mystery. Chapter 16, The Ash Still Falls. There's one place in Pompeii that no one can ever visit, not because it's locked, not because it's hidden, but because it's gone. A modest home, just outside the amphitheater. One room, a hearth, a narrow bed. It was recorded once, a sketch from the 1800s. And then it collapsed, crushed, forgotten. But something within it remained, scratched into the wall, not in Latin, not in Greek, but in Oscan, the old tongue, the voice of Pompeii before Rome. And it said, "We are still here, not spoken by the wealthy, not etched by priests, not left by names we remember, but by someone forgotten, but not silent. Because Pompeii, in the end, is not just a ruin, not just ash, not just tragedy. It is a collection of voices, voices that never expected to be heard. A girl drawing waves, a mother holding tight, a writer pressing his final word, a lover turning toward the sea, each whispering the same truth. We were real. The ash still falls, not from the sky, but from the pages of history, from the quiet between stones, from the outline of a hand pressed into plaster 2,000 years ago. And now, as the fire dims, as the shadows settle, as the night deepens, I hope you feel them, not as statues, not as myths, but as people, living, laughing, fearing, waiting, just like us. So thank you for walking with them, for listening, for remembering. And when you lie back tonight, if you listen closely, beyond the ticking of clocks, beyond the wind at your window, you might just hear it, a breath, a step, a quiet, ancient whisper. We are still here. Good night, traveler. We'll see you again, next time, in the ashes of another forgotten world.